I also would like to thank for the opportunity to be in this important event. So I will bring some examples from Brazil, India, and South Africa of the challenges and difficulties encountered in implementing ABS. So, as already shown previously, this is the Access and Benefit Sharing Clearinghouse, and in green we have all the countries that are party to the Nagoya Protocol. Today we have 142 countries, parties, and this means that we have 142 different ABS legislations, as already presented by the previous speakers. And several of them with tight controls and restrictions for accessing their microorganisms. Consequently, international culture collections have great difficulties for distributing these microorganisms, the microorganisms from these countries, and result in some cases the removal of them from the catalogs of the culture collections, and even the exclusion of strains coming to serve as type material for the validation of species names. And I will talk more about this later on. And one of these countries is Brazil. We have in place an ABS legislation here since 2001. And in 2015, we had the publication of the law 13123 that brought several improvements. And one of them is that there is no approval by the competent authority or benefit sharing for research and development involving genetic resources. So the PIC and the MET for research and development using the genetic resources is already authorized by the National Congress. And this means that we don't have a previous authorization by the national competent authority, but instead we have a registration in the National System for the Management of Genetic Heritage and Associated Traditional Knowledge, the SISGEN, an online system for research, development, and shipment of genetic resources abroad. So the registration is a mandatory and declaratory instrument for activities of access. Here in Brazil, access means utilization of genetic resources or associated traditional knowledge, or the transfer of genetic resources abroad. So here we can conduct research and development using the Brazilian biodiversity without any requirement. However, the registration must be performed prior to some activities. Among them, the publication of results in scientific or communication circles, the request of any intellectual property right, and the shipment abroad, which depends on the signature of a material transfer agreement that will predict. It shall be interpreted in accordance to the Brazilian law, and it will contain clauses that authorizes or prohibits the transfer of the genetic research to third parties. This means that if I deposit a microorganism in a culture collection, here or abroad, I can authorize that this material can be provided to third parties without a prior authorization, but of course with a material transfer agreement with these requirements. So now I will talk about the problems faced by Brazil, India, and South Africa regarding the validation of prokaryotic names. Here we have the International Committee on Systematics of Prokaryotes that is responsible for the validation of the new bacteria and archaea names through the International Code of Nomenclature of Prokaryotes. This code, according to the code, for acceptance of a culture of the type strain, acceptance of a new prokaryote species, a culture of this species must be deposited in a culture collection of at least 2 different countries, where unrestricted subcultures must be available. And here we have the International Journal of Systematic and Evolutionary Microbiology, which is the official publication of the International Committee on Systematics of Prokaryotes, and is the journal of record for publication of novel microbial taxa. And unfortunately, in the last years, since 2020, the journal has informed several authors from these 3 countries, Brazil, India, and South Africa, that according to the requirements of the international code, the journal could no longer accept proof of deposit of type strains coming from these 3 countries. So the taxonomists of bacteria and archaea from these countries are receiving this message, where it says that due to certain restrictions and in keeping in line with the requirements of the bacteriological code, we cannot accept proof of deposit from culture collections based in India, South Africa, or Brazil. And in addition, many international culture collections are also not accepting the deposit of microorganisms coming from these countries because of these ABS regulations. So in the last years, the microbiologists from these countries are facing big difficulties. They are prevented of validating the names of prokaryotes, new prokaryotes that are described in these 3 countries, which is a huge impact for different fields of microbiology. And because of this, I and some colleagues from the World Federation for Culture Collections got together to write this paper on how legislations affect new taxonomic description in trends in microbiology in 2023. And from this article, we have this scheme where we show the export and access regulations that impact the distribution of strains deposited in culture collections. And these regulations here, these requirements here, are understood as restrictions by the International Prokaryote Committee, by the culture collections, based on these rules from the Prokaryote Code. So here we have the different regulations from the 3 countries. And as we can see here, South Africa doesn't require an MTA, but they require an approval by a competent authority and a national partner. India requires an MTA and approval by a competent authority, but they don't require a national partner. In the case of Brazil, we require an MTA. We don't require an approval by a competent authority, as I already explained it earlier on, and we require a national partner. Currently, MTA is no longer a problem here, but here are still the big problems, the approval by a competent authority and national partner. And in the case of Brazil, this is our biggest problem. So going back to the Brazilian legislation, Brazilian biodiversity can only be accessed by foreign institution partnership with Brazilian institution that will be responsible for the registration of the project in CIGEM, in the online system. And we can imagine the difficulty of a foreigner to look for a foreigner who doesn't have scientific collaboration in Brazil, to have the difficulty to find someone in Brazil to ask for registering the project in which he or she does not participate. So this, in fact, is a big issue, not only for prokaryote studies, but also for any research using biodiversity from Brazil, other organisms from the Brazilian biodiversity. And because of this became a priority for the academic chamber, which I coordinate and which is linked to the National Competent Authority. And in the last years, we have been looking for solutions. And finally, in this present government, with the help of the current government, we have concrete solutions. So the solution proposed for foreigners who do not have scientific collaboration in Brazil involves a pre-registration accessible to foreigners in the SIGEM, the electronic system SIGEM. So the foreigner can get in and after some steps gives the information on the project. In parallel, it's also been constituted a network of Brazilian scientific institutions linked to the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Science and Technology, and also universities as potential scientific partners for researchers who do not have collaboration in Brazil. So in this module in SIGEM, the foreigner can also find a list of these partners to choose one of them. But this partnership will be to comply with the legislation, but not only, it can also evolve in a scientific collaboration, who knows? So now going back to the article, in the end, we have some, in the conclusion of the article, we have some proposed solutions that I bring here. An alternative might be to move from a system that requires prior authorization to a declaration system in which the various stakeholders who have collected administrative data on access and distribution of genetic resources upload the validated information into an open access database. And this would allow countries of origin to monitor the flow and distribution of their genetic resources and ultimately benefit from the use of their biological assets. So you can see some similarities with the Brazilian system. And such a move goes also towards a more multilateral approach of the ABS international system. So with this, I finish.